Good contrast. Hello and welcome to the programme which brings together leading UK columnists, BBC specialists and the foreign correspondents who write, blog and broadcast to audiences back home from the Dateline London. It's been a week either of sequels or of reruns. In the UK, we're waiting for Sue Gray again and her report on partying in government whilst the country was in COVID lockdown. Boris Johnson and the European Commission are wrestling over Northern Ireland post-Brexit again. COVID surges and an authoritarian government in Asia locks down again. And polling made Australia's politicians nervous about the outcome of this weekend's election. Yes, you guessed it, again. In the studio are the Irish journalist Suzanne Lynch, who writes for the Politico's Brussels Playbook, Janet Daly, American by birth, British by choice, whose weekly column appears in the Sunday Telegraph, and newly returned from filming in Cambodia, the BBC's Asia-Pacific editor, Celia Hatton. Welcome to all of you. Thanks very much for coming in. Let's begin with Partygate, Janet. The fines are in and they're over. There won't be any more now. Is Boris Johnson's leadership secure, do you think?
For the moment, yes, but that's heavily caveated, I think. I don't agree with the people who say this is all about cake. Why are we talking about cake when there's a war on and there's an energy crisis and all of that? I don't actually think that's very convincing. There are people who will never, ever forget this incident because they had life-changing bereavements, people whose parents died without being able to visit them, grandparents who died before they got to see newborn grandchildren. Terrible, terrible things happened, and those people will never forget. But I think there's a wider sense in which there is an impression of shambolic irresponsibility in Downing Street, and that's going to lie there quietly until it revives again. And I think they're going to have to be very, very careful to see to it that that impression of jocularity and irresponsibility, of having laid down rules which were, I disliked most of those rules anyway. They were incomprehensible very often, they were contradictory, they were incoherent, but a lot of people obeyed them. And they didn't, apparently. And it's not just about the birthday incident either. There is talk, we know that Boris Johnson and his wife held social gatherings in their own apartment. The idea that the people who made those rules were cheerfully, perhaps in a jocular mood, disobeying them, that can easily come back to bite him again.
Could that be, Suzanne, the big thing out of the Sue Gray report? Not so much how many parties, who went to them, who their names are. And we're told that she's warning people who she plans to single out and name, they have to respond before the end of this weekend, or she's going to name them or give a reason why they shouldn't be named. Could it be that's more damaging if this report paints a picture of a kind of dysfunctional number 10, a place where there was chaos, there was lack of organisation, ultimately there was lack of leadership?
Yes, it is showing up a lot of the characteristics that critics of Boris Johnson have been saying about him for years. So that's why I think it's politically difficult. In saying that, I think some of the heat has been taken out of the situation. This has now gone on for so long. In a sense, voters have already banked the fact that this has happened. And ultimately, the way the political wind seems to be blowing is that within his own party, Boris Johnson looks like he's going to survive this, that there is not going to be that push against him. And I think the timing of this has been very interesting and it's been very fortuitous for Boris Johnson, how this played out. Now, we need to see, this report is coming during next week. There's lots of speculation about who will be named, how damning will it be, or will it be pretty dull? I think that might also have an impact on how this ultimately plays out. You
have to bear in mind that Keir Starmer has his own problems.
This is the Labour leader.
Yes, in this respect. And he has made perhaps the rather foolish unforced error of saying he will resign if he gets a fine. So now he either gets a fine and he doesn't resign, or he gets a fine and he does resign, or there is a suspicion that the police are holding back because they don't want to be in an invidious position of putting him out of his job by giving him a fine. That's not a very happy situation for him.
No, and I just wonder about the international sort of kind of resonance of this. Ireland had its problems with lockdown parties, didn't it?
It did, and again, exactly what Janet was saying there, the public, really felt this. This is something everybody lives through, and it's politically very difficult territory for politicians. In Ireland, there was a controversy about politicians attending a golf dinner, and it led to resignations. It actually led to the resignation of an EU commissioner. Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, let go. Phil Hogan said he had to resign. So it's very politically difficult. But internationally, I mean, this story did get a lot of legs, but more back in February, March, when it first came on the scene. We had pictures on international media, old pictures of Boris Johnson in kind of, unserious poses. It hasn't.
Are there many of those around?
There are a few. They can be found. And this was, again, as I was saying, feeding into a narrative, right or wrongly, about Boris Johnson. So so far there hasn't been huge media interest over the last few weeks that this has dragged on. But again, with the Sue Gray report, let's see, it may well come back onto the headlines.
How's it playing internationally in your region? Is there much awareness of it?
In some countries, there's been no comment on it, but I have noticed in the Chinese state media recently, they've been paying a little bit more attention to Boris Johnson and rules that have been broken, using that to point out, well, look, we're enforcing our zero COVID strategy, which has made a lot of people miserable, but at least we're sticking with it. You haven't caught any government officials breaking those rules, and that's been politically useful for some government officials in China.
I can imagine. Let's talk about Brexit again. It's been a while since we talked about it, Janet. We've missed it. The protocol. Here we go again.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much noise and so much drama attached to this. And I mean, trade agreements are renegotiated all the time. There's nothing new about that. The problem comes when one side is being uncooperative about those negotiations. And of course, Britain would say that that's what the EU is doing. And the whole thing has been so theatrical right from the off. I mean, all those visits that Leo Varadkar had from EU officials. I mean, Ireland was virtually ignored by the EU until that point, except to be bullied into reducing its corporation tax because it was uncompetitive with the rest of the EU. And suddenly Leo Varadkar was the great star. He must have been thrilled. And now we're in this position where, I mean, I'm sorry to be so partisan about this, but the Remain camp in Parliament thought they had found the magic bullet. This was the immovable object. This was the unsolvable problem for the EU, the business about the hard border in Ireland. And it's perfectly true that you cannot create a hard border in Ireland across, from the Republic.
So in other words, you can't have customs checks between Northern Ireland and the Republic.
We're talking about a tiny, tiny proportion of trade. Most of the trade that Ulster does is with the UK, not with the Republic. The whole thing has become so overblown and so theatrical. And now we have Nancy Pelosi marching in with her own theatrics, saying Congress won't approve of a trade deal, a free trade deal with the US. But she's not going to be running Congress.
No, that doesn't look like it at the moment.
No,
anyway.
The Democrats are going to lose the control
to
of Congress.
To be fair, Robert Chalet is not in Congress. He's in the US State Department. He's Antony Blinken's most senior advisor. And he said on Friday, we want to see this issue resolved and we want to see temperature lowered. And
well, stop talking about it then.
And we don't want unilateral acts. In other words, they don't want the British tearing up as they are threatening to do.
Yeah, they're threatening. I mean, the idea that anybody at this point in time, with the war going on in Ukraine and with the dreadful sort of cost of living emergency that's occurring all over the West, not just here, the idea that anybody would tear up an agreement and provoke a trade war is insane. I mean, it could happen. This is like the prelude to the First World War. People
why is the
did
British
stupid
government
things.
doing that?
It isn't. Not yet. No, I'm not saying it won't,
No.
but I'm saying at the moment it isn't. This is all noise.
Suzanne.
Well, look, I'm in Brussels at the moment. I was in Washington for the last few years, and the number one mistake I would say some members of the British government make is that they think that the US doesn't know anything about this. Those figures in Congress are following this, are following it very much in detail. So, they know what's going on in terms of Northern Ireland Protocol. But in terms of Brussels, over the last few months, nobody in Brussels wants to talk about Brexit. They have moved on, as we're saying, we've got Ukraine war in particular. They're trying to get their own coherent position on that. So the EU member states were happy to let the Commission do the negotiations, and then there was kind of a truce before the Northern Ireland elections. But now, in the last week, this has completely changed. So Maros Šefčovič, the EU Commissioner, he briefed EU ambassadors on Wednesday after the announcement by Liz Truss. The feeling... This is an
announcement that the government will legislate unless it can get renegotiated.
Exactly. Now, Janet's absolutely right. They didn't actually legislate yet. So the big question in Brussels is this buying more time? Is this a bluff?
They published a bill with the title on and that was it.
Exactly. So officials are saying when it does get serious is when that bill is tabled and then if and when it is passed, which could take months. So look, there is a window of opportunity for more negotiation. In saying that, I mean, customs are the main issue, and customs are the main issue for the unionist community. I think what did trigger alarm bells was the fact that Liz Truss spoke about the European Court of Justice and VAT and all these other bigger issues that are supposed to be already finished. So if I think the two sides can keep it on the customs issue, well, I think it's a strong possibility that there'll be an agreement.
I mean, it has already been resolved on medicines, hasn't it? They've gone there. There will be no checks on medicines.
No, it's perfectly possible, and animals too. The importation of live animals. I mean, there's no reason why this can't be resolved. It's become a vanity issue.
Yeah, but the other issue, though, is the DUP, the Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, have said they won't go into power sharing. So that's the problem. Now, I've heard people saying that the British government, instead of trying to bring the DUP along, have kind of riled it up as an issue, and that they're taking their side in a sense. So that's one way of seeing that. But the other issue about the customs, yes, it's only a few sausages. People say, what's the big deal? The problem is, though, in the longer term, as Britain, as the years go on and Britain diverges from EU standards and it signs a trade deal, say with America eventually or Australia, then you're going to have completely different products. And that's when there's going to be an issue for the EU, that these will get into Northern Ireland and then across the border.
And that raises concerns for third parties, doesn't it? Other countries that trade with Europe around the world, who presumably get nervous about this kind of talk of divergence, do they? Because they worry about, if we're doing trade with the UK, what are the implications for us in securing our trade relationship with Europe?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's an ongoing issue, and it's really, we're going to have to see how this unfolds. But as you know, as the UK starts to talk to more countries and starts to try to hash out trade deals with more countries, of course, it's going to be a big issue.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the long term, it is a conundrum, this border issue. And officials in Brussels have been telling me this week why they're particularly annoyed is because it's not like there's a new government in Britain. It's the same government who signed the deal. And their view is that the Prime Minister was cynical, that he wanted a deal, he just wanted Brexit done, he actually knew that these problems were there, and he just put his head in the sand, and now they're still there.
It wasn't so much a head in the sand. The alternative was a no deal, leaving without a deal. And that was the impossible choice that this kind of Remainer EU alliance presented him with. And so he took what he did regard as an unsatisfactory deal, hoping that it could be renegotiated afterwards, and that may yet come to pass.
But there was another deal. Theresa May had another proposal, which could have been, so that was another option. But I mean, people are saying we cannot sign an agreement if then somebody says, actually, in a few years we don't agree with this.
Who knows? Maybe it'll be third time lucky. Let's talk about COVID. It's back, and it's back with a vengeance in North Korea. Celia.
Absolutely. I mean, this is only one of 2 countries in the world that has no vaccination program. It's also the first country in the world that closed its borders completely when China first announced that it had had a mysterious flu virus spreading across the country. So it went through this course where it tried to shut down almost all trade, it shut down its borders, and then it relaxed. And a few weeks ago, it had what is now thought to be a super spreader event, a military parade in Pyongyang. Many people were not wearing masks. And now we're seeing more than 2 million cases of fever. Now, what's heartbreaking is that we really don't know how many of those cases are COVID, how many are measles or typhoid, which is also a massive problem in North Korea right now because there's simply not that many tests. So why did Kim Jong-un suddenly decide to announce, after many theoretical outbreaks, rumored outbreaks of COVID in the past?
All of which were denied.
All of which were denied. Why now? Why is he announcing this now and very publicly going on television, attending emergency meetings every day? It's really thought that this is going to be a massive crisis. This is a country where around 40% of the population is already undernourished. In theory, back in 2019, we knew that the North Koreans were reusing syringes, reusing medical equipment.
Reusing syringes?
Exactly. They were apparently becoming rusty. They were used so often. And so think about COVID ripping through that kind of population. It really is quite scary.
But they've had offers from China and South Korea of help, and they're saying no. So what are people being advised to do at the moment?
Well, actually, we think now that they have accepted some help from China. We know of 3 flights that have gone between China and North Korea just in the past couple of days, taking medical supplies over. But that's just 3 plane loads for a country of around 25 million people. So what does Kim Jong-un do? Does he allow NGOs back into the country, allow aid on a massive basis, allow vaccines to finally come in? or does he allow COVID to rip through the country? I think right now he's trying to take kind of a shaky middle ground. He's allowing China to get involved a little bit, which maybe is a little bit more politically palatable. He is deflecting blame and placing a lot of blame on local officials and sort of middle-level officials. And I think he's just waiting and seeing and trying to prescribe traditional medicines. There's also the possibility he'll have another nuclear test while Joe Biden is in the region. They say preparations are completely ready. So he'll try to deflect attention. But how long he can continue on that shaky middle ground before he really has to make a choice between opening the borders or just letting COVID rip through.
And meanwhile,
he doesn't have much time.
And meanwhile, what advice are people being given?
Well, they're being told, I mean, we don't know exactly what's happening in the hinterlands, but we know that they're being advised to gargle with salt water, for example, or they're being advised that traditional medicines are best. But frankly, that's because North Korea doesn't have a lot of other alternatives at the moment. What's going to happen when they decide that they really do need to vaccinate the country? Is it too late? Probably. And that's really what's difficult, is that Kim Jong-un has apparently repeatedly turned down offers from the WHO, the COVAX program, to come in because they wanted to dictate where exactly the vaccines went. And the North Koreans really just didn't want that much intervention inside their own country, and so they really shut their borders, and then it seems probably relaxed a bit too much.
Jana, there was a big debate, wasn't there, early in the COVID, at the start of the pandemic, about which forms of government will work best. And we've, some saying, well, actually, maybe authoritarian regimes will do a better job simply because they have control. But actually, as China has proved with its zero COVID policy, it ain't necessarily so.
No, I mean, you get lots of authoritarianism. The authoritarianism gets ranked up, but it doesn't necessarily work. It is extraordinary, that resurgence in China, quite extraordinary.
And also, I mean, with the authoritarian regimes, you have a lack of information. Like, as you pointed out, you don't actually know what's happening in these places.
Yeah.
And that's part of this problem. When you're not getting the full facts, it's very hard to gauge what's actually happening and how best to help people.
It is extraordinary how democratically accountable governments, though, were able to, many of them, to bring in very, very successful vaccination programs like this country.
Yeah.
That was quite startling, and it means that democratic societies on the whole seem to produce well-behaved people who have social responsibility and who behave as they should in those circumstances.
And I suppose it's interesting looking at, as well at the French presidential result. A lot of people thought Macron would suffer for his quite the strong line taken, for example, over COVID passports, saying, no, you can't go into a restaurant or a theatre or all the rest of it without this. And yet it didn't appear to be the case that people punished him.
I think maybe the choices were not particularly...
And also
Macron or a fascist, you know. I mean,
also the timing. I mean, again, he was quite lucky. By the time the election happened, we had kind of Macron, the statesman, with the war in Ukraine, even though a lot of other people were critical of Macron's kind of overtures or dialogue with Putin, it seemed to play well in his own country. So I think the news agenda had moved on at that point, and it benefited him.
Let's talk about another election that's happening this weekend. We don't know the result as we sit here, but apparently half of the votes have already been cast, because voting is compulsory in Australia, and a lot of people vote on in all the ways, postal ways. Apparently they've been allowed to vote by telephone if they have COVID now, which is a new innovation that's come in. 3 years ago, Celia, it was a tight race, and everybody thought Bill Shorten's Labour Party was going to depose the Liberal National Coalition. And Scott Morrison, he calls it his miracle election. Is he hoping for another miracle?
Oh, I think he is hoping for another miracle. I mean, the pollsters, who knows? The pollsters were wrong before. It's unclear, as you said. We're really not sure what's going to happen now. But I think what's fascinating is that the debate in this election, you would think that it might have turned more to climate change than it has.
Given everything that's happened over the last 3 years.
Exactly. We've seen epic forest fires in Australia. And some polls show that this is the #1 issue for voters, that they really care about climate change. But both of the major leading parties don't seem to want to discuss it in any great, or they haven't come out with a huge...
Presumably Labour think it got punished last time because it did those policies, and they finished it in some, for example, the mining states, Western Australia.
Perhaps. But I mean, so what's really interesting is the emergence of the so-called teal independents, around 20 women who are running as independents, who are fiscally conservative, but really are running on very, very strong climate change agendas. And they have a huge amount of grassroots support, a huge amount of financial backing. And I think it's really going to be interesting to see if they want to turn the tide in Australian politics.
Yeah, I mean, the other issue I think is going to be really interesting to watch is the kind of geopolitical aspect of what's happening, and Scott Morrison's handling of these big challenges, particularly from China.
Yeah.
And I think he's getting a lot of criticism, and his foreign minister as well, for taking their eye off the ball when it came to the Solomon Islands. Obviously, China, there's now a pact between the Solomon Islands,
Yes,
which was
they kind of snuck in without anyone noticing, yes.
And even at the same time as Australia did this famous AUKUS defence deal, people remember last autumn, which really annoyed the Europeans.
UK and the US.
Yes, really annoyed France.
That was great.
But really annoyed France. It was the US, UK and Australia. Great. Scott Morrison looked like the great global leader, and yet in their own backyard, they took the eye off the ball. And I think there are kind of questions now about leadership there in terms of the big geopolitical issues at a time where it's a very important issue for Australia.
One thing, though, it's really been interesting to watch the Chinese debate, watching the Australian election. So we've heard some signals this week that China has been saying, you know, this might be a time for us to turn the chapter. We might be able to, after the election...
Ideally with a new Prime Minister.
Yeah, we're open to starting to, you know, and I wonder whether this has something to do with the fact that China and Australia are such key trading partners. You know, the Chinese economy is really hurting right now.
Yeah.
Are they really starting to think, actually,
Yeah,
you know, this
let's
has gone a
go
bit
with
too
these.
far?
Yeah.
Presumably all those COVID lockdowns must have hit, as much as people in the West complain about supplies from China not getting through. The reality is, at home, it must have been really painful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
New economic figures out this week really showed, you know, retail sales way down, exports way down. So it's a really quite a shocking time for the Chinese economy. So maybe that'll affect relations with Australia.
And the Chinese social relations as well. I mean, the Chinese have, and the idea that it's a communist state in any sense that Marx would recognize is absurd. I mean, they've positively encouraged the growth of a very wealthy, acquisitive bourgeoisie. Yeah. What's going to happen if their economy tanks?
Just on that question of possible reset with Australia, some criticism, unsurprisingly, on the political right, but perhaps more broadly on people who worry about China, about the approach of Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, that she's been a bit too reluctant to criticise China, a bit too cosy perhaps with Beijing. Presumably Beijing would quite like a relationship like that with an incoming Anthony Albanese government in Australian Labor in Canberra. But presumably for the Australians, it's a bit more complicated.
Oh, I should think so, yes. I mean, Australia is in this, geographically, this pivotal position. You know, they could easily pivot to the east, as they always say in America, about California. But, I mean, they are basically British in their mentality, and they're very, very strongly democratic. I mean, how can they possibly come to terms with a close relationship with a state as a totalitarian country? I mean, it could be done, but it'd be very uncomfortable politically and culturally.
But I think that's what one of the big themes of the last decade has been, a change towards China. As you say, in Australia, look at America, before the Ukraine war, Joe Biden's absolute foreign policy priority was China. He continued that after Donald Trump, and he said we need to get tough on China in terms of trade, etc. Europe as well, you know, it was a bit too close to Beijing. Certainly Washington felt that, Biden administration did, and now it's the divisions there, but people are beginning to question that they put economic growth, economic possibilities ahead of concerns about human rights abuses, etc. So, you know, there has been, I think, a global Western, if you like, shift towards China, and it's gone from being, you know, an economic place of opportunity to being a threat geopolitically in terms of human rights.
I think it's just interesting when we think about China, and yes, I think Australia has actually been criticised from the people that I've been speaking to, just going too far. They unilaterally came out and said, look, we need an inquiry into how COVID really came about in China.
Quite a
confrontational approach. When you contrast that with, you know, maybe Singapore's relationship with China, even Japan's relationship with China is a little bit more nuanced in how they deliver their messages. And I think now that we're in a position where a lot of countries are looking to China to think that actually they have a pivotal role to play with Russia and how Russia, you know, deals with Ukraine. And so a lot of countries are thinking, well, actually, maybe we really do need to kind of improve our relationship with China in order to use that leverage with Russia
and on climate change. On climate change, the idea that you need to work with you hear people like John Kerry saying that, like, we need to work with China on this. It's a global issue, and
but actually, that's one of the issues where you hear again and again. We're actually, there are quite good relationships between Americans and Chinese scientists. There are quite good relationships when it comes to climate change. In fact, that's usually the only issue that's pointed out as being the thing that the two countries can agree on.
There, some cause for optimism. Janet Daly, Celia Hatton, and Suzanne Lynch, thank you all very much. Thank you too very much for your company. We'll be back same time next weekend with more Dateline London. Goodbye.